Massive multiplayer online RPGs, or MMORPGs, typically isn't my kind of genre. I've only dabbled with Final Fantasy XI for a handful of months back in the day, certainly enough to understand the struggles of waiting for a party in the Valkyrie Dunes, but I wouldn't call myself well educated on the game. Aside from that, and a little bit of MapleStory, I don't think I've touched a single other MMO. If nothing else, a monthly subscription tends to be a strong deterrent for me, but if you put Final Fantasy in the title, then I'm likely going to give it a chance. For those unaware, the version of Final Fantasy XIV that is well known today wasn't the original release by a long shot. Version 1.0 and its later updates tried to be more faithful to the slower pace of Final Fantasy XI while also implementing some quality of life improvements, such as freely changing jobs on the fly, a streamlined ability list that doesn't require going through a bunch of menus, and a more involved crafting system. However, the short story is that Final Fantasy XIV ended up being a monumental failure. The reasoning is certainly debatable. Many might argue that it was simply worse overall in comparison to Final Fantasy XI. However, there's no question that World of Warcraft, most notably its later updates, had long since changed the landscape for MMOs. And perhaps there simply wasn't a market for a new IP in this style anymore. Regardless of the reason, the game had a total crash and burn, and after about only 1 year of service, Square Enix announced that it was both shutting down and relaunching Final Fantasy XIV in a 2.0 update known as A Realm Reborn. And the rest is history. It would be an understatement to say that this was merely an overhaul of the game's mechanics. Realm Reborn is practically a brand new game altogether, and it's easy to see the influences that it took from World of Warcraft. From the gameplay being much faster paced, to areas on the ground being highlighted as a warning of enemy attacks. Realm Reborn no doubt cost Square Enix a ton of money, requiring much of the game to be remade from the ground up, with a totally different combat system and entirely new maps. The game is now just shy of 6 years after that relaunch, and with 2 additional expansions, plus a third on the way, it's safe to say that the Realm Reborn project was a gamble which has paid itself off several times over. The quality of the game on its own merits is an entirely separate topic, and giving it a recommendation one way or the other is going to depend on a case-by-case basis. This game is not a one-size-fits-all by any means, and there are several problems that will no doubt be deal breakers for many players. However, for those willing to get through the rough patches and see the full adventure to the end, I would argue that it does manage to be a fulfilling and memorable experience, with both the story and the base game mechanics being surprisingly engaging, despite the game's repetitive nature. The story mainly covers the long-running and seemingly endless expansion of the powerful Garlean Empire as they attempt to, basically, take over the entire world and place it under a single ruler. In typical JRPG fashion, the player character starts off as a nobody, but proves themselves to be incredibly efficient at accomplishing tasks. From taking on a group of pirates to fighting off dragons, and eventually leading to battles against the Empire directly, all the while uncovering a much larger conspiracy dealing with powerful shadowy agents and a battle between the Elder Gods of Light and Dark. The beginning of Realm Reborn's story is very slow to start. Much of the time is spent introducing and fleshing out the main characters, mainly the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, who act as a Justice League of sorts. A ton of time is also spent on the 3 city-states, their individual leaders, and the local problems that they have to deal with. Unfortunately, so much time is spent on establishing the setting that the story feels like it never progresses, and the number and length of the fetch quests gets pretty insulting after a while. The quests that lead up to the boss fights against Titan, and later on Garuda, are especially bad and represent pretty harsh low points. Once you reach the game's climax at level 50, it barely feels as such. I mean, yeah, the battles against the Garlean elites is pretty awesome, but to say that it took forever to get to that point would be putting it lightly. This isn't necessarily because it takes a long time to level up per se. I think the pace of leveling is just fine for 1 or 2 jobs, and while doing more than that can get sluggish, It's not grinding for experience points that's my issue here. What drags the game down is an absolutely relentless barrage of dialogue boxes. It needs to be understood that this is a Final Fantasy game first and foremost, and there is a ton of reading to get through the story. But that's a bit of a problem in this case. Since this is a multiplayer game, you kind of want to hurry and catch up to the end where your friends and most of the game's population is waiting for you. But there's a ridiculous amount of single-player content to get through first. That, and like I already said, the story is initially quite a slog, but eventually the game does start to pick up the pace. The reveal of Leviathan, and later on Ramu and Shiva, are interesting highlights, and the story starts doing a better job at showcasing the relationships between the city-states, the beast tribes, and their summoned gods. The story finally ends on an intriguing note, with an inside job managing to destabilize an established government and placing the blame on the player character's party, leading them to be forced into exile and seeking refuge in the neighboring country of Ishgard, leading to the Heavensward expansion and beyond. I can't emphasize enough about how drastic of an improvement the story is for both Heavensward and the following expansion, Stormblood. Exploring the land of the dragons with a party of 4, all of whom are reluctant to work together but have their own motivations and do so to reach a common goal, is extremely reminiscent of a traditional Final Fantasy game. This is also around that time that Alphinaud finally develops a personality, which is good because you're going to be seeing a lot of him, and he used to be the most boring character. But now he's not so bad. Both Heavensward and Stormblood still take their time introducing their own unique settings, however it's done so far more succinctly. The main points are established and then moved out of the way to allow the characters to stay on the center stage. The general quality of Stormblood's story is also really good, but it doesn't have quite the same punch that Heavensward did. It might have to do with jumping between the countries of Girabania and Authard, each on complete opposite ends of the world, so a bit of focus is lost as the attention is split between two fronts. Not terrible, but I do wish it was handled a little better. However, some highlights, like dealing with the different tribes of the Azim Steppe, or pretty much any time that Xeno shows up, does make the story enjoyable. The narrative is complemented by some pretty great writing and other atmospheric touches. One of Final Fantasy XIV's greatest strengths in presentation is having a variety of cultures and maintaining their consistency. For example, whenever a character says the line "Thal's balls," then you know that they hail from Ul'dah, or at least the greater Thanalan area. This is because Thal is one of the revered gods there, and by balls the character is making a derogatory statement. It would be the equivalent of saying "God damn it" in real life, but Final Fantasy XIV makes it its own and does so really well. And the game does this all the time, with the citizens of Limsa Lominsa having an obnoxious pirate-like dialect, and the people of Gridania always making it a point to show both a respect and a fear of nature. This also extends to the beast tribes, all of whom have their own hierarchy and organization systems, and they all worship their own gods for their own reasons, like Ifrit for the Amalja, who wish to expand their territory, or Titan for the kobolds, who wish to defend and salvage what's left of theirs. There's an unreasonable amount of lore here to cover. However, you don't scour through tons of item descriptions and make assumptions to figure this stuff out. All the important points are laid bare in the story. That's not to say that there aren't item descriptions, there are, but it's almost entirely flavor text and nothing else, or as a way for the writers to sneak in a cute joke. The big takeaway from all this is that this is a good story. It's really slow to get going, but once you hit the good parts, then it keeps getting better. Even so, the game is definitely unbalanced between its storytelling and its gameplay. And I do believe it would be better serviced if the game could figure out how to streamline its storytelling more efficiently. Fewer fetch quests, fewer world tours, less of go to this guy just to tell him what this person said and then go back again and repeat this 50 times over. Oh, okay, make no... Can these people not talk to each other? Like, oh my... There are better ways to tell a story, but regardless of all that, This is a video game, and it needs to be fun to be worth playing in the first place. As I explained earlier, I'm in a position that I can't really compare this to World of Warcraft or other similar MMOs. But on its own merits, Final Fantasy XIV definitely has some ups and downs. Much like the story, the gameplay is really slow to get going. It's based around utilizing a massive set of different abilities while dodging enemy attacks in a real-time combat system. These range from basic single-target attacks to a variety of different group attacks, temporary power-ups, and other little bits of utility. What's most interesting to me is how many jobs have their own spin on the base mechanics. Even though Black Mage, Red Mage, and Summoner are all offensive mages, they each have their own unique resources to manage and goals they need to achieve for each battle in order to maximize their damage output. Black Mages need to balance their fire and ice magic in order to emphasize maximum damage and MP regeneration respectively. Summoners have a slew of unique abilities, such as multiple poison attacks, while managing their summoned pet and attempting to build up their meter in order to power themselves up and summon more stronger monsters. Red Mages fill an interesting gap as they still have longer cast times for their spells, however unique abilities such as quick dashes, backflips, and dual casting helps keep them very mobile in comparison to the other spellcasters. And this is just for 3 jobs in a single role. Every job handles itself in a very different way. Players can stick with a straightforward Dragoon utilizing a longer 5-hit combo, the more complex Monk and his free flow style of interchangeable 9-hit combos, or the Ninja with his multi-purpose ninjutsu abilities, with different combinations of moves leading to different attacks, and all this has to be managed while dodging enemy attacks and adhering to the unique rules and mechanics of the fight in question. It often turns into a game of distractions where falling for tunnel vision will usually get you killed. Even all 3 tanks and healers meet their objectives in slightly different ways, and there will undoubtedly be at least 1 or 2 jobs that will appeal to any given player. But before you can see any of the depth that these abilities offer the player, you have to start at level 1 and only spamming a single attack. While you do unlock more attacks and other abilities rather quickly, it does take a long time before the game's combat finally starts to open itself up. When the game is at its best, it's incredibly fun. Trying to figure out and react to a boss's attacks and the unique quirks of a new dungeon on the fly is great. Utilizing the unique abilities of your job in order to get through awkward situations is wonderful. And even though much of the game is based around repeating the same dungeons over and over, it's still awesome to do every time because pulling off your job's combos while dodging the enemy's attacks is always fun. And it's a satisfying challenge to try to complete a dungeon even faster the next time around. The foundation of this game, namely the dungeons and the boss fights, is really well put together. However, in order to get to that point, you have to deal with a really slow start. You need to get through a veritable textbook worth of dialogue throughout the whole game, and you're stuck with boring abilities and overly basic combat early on. If you're willing to stick with it, then it actually turns out to be a good game in the end. But that's exactly like saying, oh, it gets good 100 hours in, and that's never a reasonable excuse. I mean, you have one of 2 options here. You either take your time with the story, immersing yourself in the world, and enjoying everything that the game has to offer. That's fine, and it's kind of what I would recommend because I personally actually like where the story is going now. But if you do this, then you'll probably spend months trying to get to the endgame where all the really good content is waiting. And I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but man, that early story content is so weak, and it's gonna make that first month a real drag to get through. Or, alternatively, you can try to rush through everything, skipping all the cutscenes and dialogue you can. If you do this, then it's not unreasonable to go from level 1 to 70 in a matter of weeks. You can probably do it while switching back and forth between 2 different jobs so that you'll have 2 jobs to play as at level 70. However, if you do it this way, then the game becomes a chore, and there's a good chance that once you do reach the end, you won't even feel like playing anymore because you're burnt out. Not to mention that you'll have a much harder time appreciating the story and setting if you're not sticking with it from the start. This is what makes the game so difficult to recommend. It's not that it's impossible to catch up or that it's too late for new players to start playing now. The game does a good job at encouraging veteran players to go back and play older content, which in turn helps newer players find these old dungeons staying populated. The real issue I have with Final Fantasy XIV is that it takes a disproportionate amount of time and effort to get through, and there's no guarantee that all of the time you invested will end up feeling personally rewarding because it takes so long before you can see what the game really has to offer. I also want to say that if you have a buddy who's already playing the game and they're willing to hang back and do this older content with you, then you're going to have a much better time. I want to say that, and it is true, but only up to a certain point, because so much of the game is single player only content. Whenever you and a buddy are going through a dungeon, then that part's awesome and you're gonna have a blast. However, the other half of the game is just reading dialogue, walking back and forth between random NPCs, doing fetch quests, watching cutscene after cutscene after cutscene. It's the kind of thing that attracts me more to the structure of games like Phantasy Star Online or Monster Hunter. Games where you just pick a map, pick a mission, and off you go. Story comes second, gameplay comes first. Final Fantasy XIV doesn't necessarily need to have that same kind of immediacy, but I do feel like it wastes the player's time too much. At the very least, like I said earlier, the story can certainly be more streamlined and have a lot less back and forth between characters who are at opposite ends of the world from each other. Before I finally end this, it's worth noting the variety of content besides the main story. There's little menial optional things to do like minigames, chocobo racing, the triple triad card game from Final Fantasy VIII, and even mahjong, among other stuff. And most of this stuff is multiplayer. I mean, just playing a versus game of triple triad alone is awesome. However, what really appeals to me isn't these completely unrelated diversions, but rather it's the different ways that the game flips the base mechanics on its head. The player versus player mode rebalances all of the jobs and limits the available skills for a much faster paced gameplay. I remember the first iteration of the game's PvP mode being a bit of a mess, so these are much welcome changes. It helps that there's a small handful of different modes and maps too, each with their own objectives, to help add more variety. There's also Deep Dungeon, which is a more traditional dungeon crawler, tasking the player, either solo or with a party, to navigate a randomly generated dungeon. Finally, the newest edition, Eureka, seems like it's trying to bring in some elements from Final Fantasy XI, with a bit more emphasis on exploration, cooperation with strangers, and things like losing experience points upon death. It's an intimidating landscape for sure, especially for low-level players, and it goes to show that the development team is always trying something new. I also really didn't have anywhere else to put this, but I gotta say that the amount of control the player is given over customizing their heads-up display is absolutely fantastic. I know this review has gone on for absolutely way too long, and I've actually cut out a lot that I wanted to cover, like how much of a terrible pain it is to get into the crafting and gathering jobs. And believe me, I tried. Seriously, don't even bother with this. But I think I got the basics out of the way. My recommendation comes down to this: play the free trial to your heart's content. There's no time limit with it, so don't feel pressured. Just try to accomplish as much as you care to and max out every job that you can. If, after all that, you enjoyed it for the most part, but you found the game to be too simple and you wish it got harder and more complex, then you are likely going to enjoy the full game. However, if you play the free trial and you get to level 30 or so, and you decide that there is absolutely nothing enjoyable for you here whatsoever, then the game is not for you. It's hard for me to say that because so much of the game doesn't open itself up until you've gotten past level 50. But I wouldn't want anyone taking a risk and putting money down on this game if they don't see anything worthwhile early on. And I'm sure that most people will get bored before they reach that point, either with the slow gameplay or the slow story. I love this game a ton. I maxed out every job during the Heavensward expansion because I couldn't get enough, and I'm well on my way to doing it all over again. But if I'm recommending it for the average person that might not be willing to put in the same time that I have, I don't know what to tell you. Give the free trial a chance, see how you like it, go from there. I think most people are going to find the game to be just okay, not a big deal, but for those who do get into it, I feel like there isn't quite anything else like it, and I'm invested enough into the story that I'm really interested in seeing where this goes. If I had to rate each individual expansion, it would probably go like so. Even though the story is weaker in Stormblood in comparison to Heavensward, the new dungeons and gameplay mechanics that were added more than make up for it. But you still gotta get through a Realm Reborn before you see any of the real good stuff, and honestly that brings down the experience quite a bit. So overall, I'd give Final Fantasy XIV as a whole a 7 out of 10. Thanks for watching my review on Final Fantasy XIV, and here's hoping that Shadowbringers turns out to be as great as the other expansions.